to Prepare the Way, a show dedicated to all matters related to the new evangelization. I am your host, Martha Fernández-Sardina, Director of the Office for Evangelization of the Archdiocese of San Antonio and of Prepare the Way Enterprises, a ministry dedicated to helping Catholics become everyday evangelized evangelizers. We are here with Patrick Madrid. He is the author of 15 books on apologetics and scripture and evangelization. He's a father of 9, happy husband, and grandfather as well, and we are talking about evangelization. Welcome back, Patrick.
Thank you, Martha. If I can offer a quick correction, it's father of 11.
11? Yeah, what did I say, 9?
9. My wife and I did have 9 at one time, but Nancy and I have 11 children.
That's great. Right. Sorry, I always get
No problem, no problem.
It's like keeping up with your books because you have so many books, and we want to talk about one of those very interesting books.
Sure.
This one is titled Search and Rescue, How to Bring Your Family and Friends into or Back to the Catholic Church. This is something that weighs heavily on people's hearts and minds, especially parents. They think, what did I do wrong? Why have my children left the faith? You give in this book 9 principles or 9 ideas for how to bring back family members. Why don't we go through them very quickly?
Let's do that, yeah.
This is part of a series, so this is part 1 of 2 on Search and Rescue. Chapter 1, let love fill your heart. Why? What is so important about love?
Well, I mean, love is the beginning of everything. Now, it's not strictly speaking true, as the Beatles said, all you need is love. You need more than that. But without love, you are, as St. Paul said, a clanging gong, a tinkling cymbal, and not good for much. It can actually be very counterproductive.
Where does he say that?
1 Corinthians 13.
And what are some of the things that he says, you may have this and may have that, but if you don't have love, what are those things that...
Oh, he says, if you preach all these wonderful sermons, if you give your body over to be burned, if you have all these great rhetorical flourishes and all that, you know so much, but if you don't have love, he says, you're nothing.
So you could have all the skills, you could be the best evangelist ever in terms of training and this and the other, and all of that is necessary. You could have these prophetic gifts of prophecy and so forth, but if you have prophecy, he says, if you have knowledge, if you have faith, but you have love, you have nothing, you are nothing, you can do nothing.
Right. And the greatest of these things is love, as he says there, that it's really the starting point for all of this. So people who are watching this right now, people who maybe have had loved ones leave the church, I know there are many people whose children have grown up and left the church, and they're under a great deal, the parents are, a great deal of stress and sorrow because they want their children to be Catholic, and son or daughter went to college and decided that he or she was no longer going to be Catholic, so it's a great pain for them. And so the love issue, it goes without saying that mothers and fathers love their children, but what about when it's somebody that you meet on an airplane, or if it's somebody in the workplace, or if it's somebody who really is not very lovable, and they are rude or they're spiteful in the way they treat you. If you want to successfully reach them with the truth, it has to be based on love. Because if it's not, and I talk about this elsewhere in the book, then it's when one way or another it's going to become ego. Right. And the ego is, of course, very deadly. You know, we have to be very careful that we don't allow our ego to be the reason why we're trying to evangelize or do apologetics. I try to take my own advice on this point, Martha, which is why I recently donated my ego to the Harvard Medical School.
Good for you.
But you know what? I got a letter of thanks from the president. He said it was the single largest gift they had ever received in their entire history.
I love your humor, but it is so true. Sometimes our ego can grow and grow and grow unless we keep it in check. And we'll get to that part of the book where you talk about that. You say here in this first chapter on love that we must develop the virtues of an apostle. And you mentioned prayer, absolute trust in God, perseverance, humility, and of course, love. Tell us a little bit about these important virtues that accompany and strengthen our love.
Well, I have studied over the years the men and women who have been very successful at bringing people into or back into the Catholic Church, the great saints primarily. And they all have those hallmarks as distinctives in their life. Now, they all had different personalities and they came at this from different angles, but the one, or the several things that are consistent are those ones that you just mentioned. I'm thinking of St. Francis de Sales as a good example. He was a 27-year-old priest, and he requested permission from his bishop to be assigned to the area right around Geneva, which had only just then, this is in the 17th century, it had only just then been legal again to be Catholic, because for a good 60, 70 years, Calvinism had a stranglehold on this area, and Catholicism was illegal there. So when it became legal again, this priest goes in, he's trying to convert these people who are 99% Calvinist, and in the way he went about this, he exemplified beginning with love, charity, which is the traditional word for what we're talking about here. We don't mean love in a sappy, syrupy, kind of a Hallmark greeting card sense. We're talking about love that seeks the good of the other person, even if it requires our suffering in order to achieve that good for somebody else. He embodied those examples, or those virtues, and that's why I use in the book, I use him as an example of that.
Prayer is one of these that you mention, and a lot of times we are quick to speak about God to someone, and we have not first spoken to God about that someone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what you're saying reminds me of the story with St. Monica and her very great sense of agitation that her son Augustine, who would not become Catholic, he was raised a Catholic but never baptized, and he knew the truth, and he got caught up in all this silliness and with the Manichaean heresy, and he was also living a pretty out there life. I mean, if you want to talk about sex, drugs, and rock and roll, he personified that in his youth, as he tells us in his book, The Confessions.
He even had a son out of wedlock, didn't he?
Yes, he did. So he understood the ways of the world, no doubt. His mother, Monica, was very distressed by this, as any good mother would be. So she was asking advice and kind of pouring her heart out to Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan. And after hearing her and all of her complaints, Ambrose wisely said to her, Monica, now it's time for you to speak less to Augustine about God and more to God about Augustine, which is the point you were making, and that is that whenever we are in a situation where we need to act, we need to speak, it should always be accompanied, begun and accompanied, and even ended, I would say, by prayer.
And after 28 years, the story goes, Augustine then came to faith, became a Catholic Christian, became a priest, a bishop, doctor of the church, and a saint, of course. Don't give up then. Pray, pray, pray. That's part of being an apostle.
The parents who are listening to this program right now who are experiencing grief over their children leaving the Catholic Church, there's great hope for them. And that's why I wrote Search and Rescue. I wrote this book as a way to be able to say, here's what you can do right now to begin helping that son or daughter come home.
And you have right here in the book an Ask Yourself Now question and section, and also Search and Rescue Action Agenda. So for every chapter, you will find some particular things to do. Chapter 2, Do It for God, Not for Victory. And you quote St. Ignatius of Loyola in saying that one is to rid oneself of self-love, self-will, and self-interest. What we were talking about before, this huge ego that can get in the way. Share with us some more about that.
Sure. Well, certainly, whenever we are doing something that has as its goal something that serves us as opposed to the other person, then that other person is simply a means to an end for us. The person is a vehicle to get something that we want. And what St. Ignatius of Loyola is pointing to there is that we need to be disinterested, detached, in the sense that I'm seeking the good of that person. And this is true of life in general, the moral life. You know, we see young men and women who live together, and they say, well, we love each other, we're going to live together. Well, what they need to understand is that when you love somebody, you don't do the very thing that will destroy them. And every time we sin or sin against somebody, it's doing it out of something that we seek to have. And this is why I wanted to emphasize this point, that in our efforts to explain and share and defend the faith, we have to be doing it as selflessly as we possibly can.
And I think personally, Patrick, and this is something that I hold myself highly accountable to at all times, it is very easy to fall into that trap. Because we must not forget that if humility is one of the highest virtues, pride is one of the highest vices, and that's exactly what brought the greatest angel of light, Lucifer, down. His pride, and he will attack each one of us. So yeah, I love it when you say in here, examine your motive, and you talk about vainglory being a straitjacket, and that we need to be careful that an unchecked ego is like a weed that grows up around the heart and chokes off its ability to be selfless. This is deadly, you say here.
Yeah, so true. I mean, I confess that I have seen that in my own life. I think most people, if they're honest, they will agree that they see that in their own lives. And this is really the beauty of Catholic spirituality, is that it is a divine weed whacker through prayer and the sacraments to get rid of those weeds. You know, they always want to keep pushing up, so the prayer and the sacraments are what helps to get rid of them. But if we allow them to go and grow unchecked, then we will, far from being a profitable servant of the Lord, we will be unprofitable servants, and we will cause more harm than good.
And we will even drive people away. People do not like egotistical Christians. They don't. And they will feel unloved. They will feel used. And surely it will do harm to
and
us.
manipulated. And
Besides the spiritual life, well, I should say as part of the spiritual life, that heavenly weed whacker is what you called it, I find that having 2, 3, 4 people who know you well and love you well to keep check on you also, and for them to be able to call you on anytime about anything and not to argue with them.
Yeah.
Because otherwise it would you agree that it would become very easy for us to be in a delusion about our grandeur?
Yeah, become a legend in our own minds.
Oh, yeah.
You know, that's very, I've seen it happen. I've seen the temptations in my own life. And I mean, it's part of the human condition. Personally speaking, I mean, my wife is an excellent person for that because she really does keep me focused and grounded. I have a spiritual director, an old Dominican priest who's retired now, very wise, and I go in and check in with him every several weeks, and it's a complete, open book, and we talk about anything and everything. And I think those kinds of things, especially the more one does this in a public sense, the more important they become.
I love the book of Revelation where it begins, the Lord calling the churches on. I see this good about you, but I hold this.
Right.
And that person, spiritual director, spouse, close friend, should be among those who
I
says,
agree.
I see this good that you're doing, but I see that it's going to your head.
Yeah.
Number 3, and then we'll go to a break.
Okay.
Use prayer and example to draw friends and family to Christ. We spoke a little bit about prayer before. How about the example? Why is that so important?
It's important because hypocrisy is another human condition that we can find ourselves falling into. It's easy to become a hypocrite, where if you have this external aura or external appearance of being good or holy or whatever, and yet interiorly it's not that way, that is very devastating for people when they place trust in you, confidence in you, and then it's betrayed. So what I'm saying in this chapter is the importance of authenticity. We have to be authentic. We have to really be who we claim to be. Not saying, none of us claims to be perfect, so I'm not talking about that, but if you are presenting yourself as a devout Catholic, be a devout Catholic. If you're presenting yourself to somebody as, hey, I'd like to talk to you about the Catholic faith and all that, it has to be real between you and God and you and the Church. Otherwise, it's just, you're just proselytizing. You're not really presenting the message authentically. So that whole chapter is devoted to that issue.
And wouldn't the example be a proof to our listener that we truly know from experience that the gospel can transform lives?
Sure.
And that's exactly what we're doing. When we're evangelizing, we are sharing with others that the gospel has the power to change our lives. When we come back from our break, we will discuss 2 more ways in which we can go out and search and rescue family and friends and bring them back to the Catholic Church. We'll be right back. Don't go away. Welcome back to Prepare the Way, a show dedicated to all matters related to the new evangelization. I am your host, Martha Fernández-Sardina, chatting here with my friend and brother in the Lord, Patrick Madrid, about search and rescue, how to bring your family and friends into or back into the Catholic faith. Patrick, you have these 9 ways in which we can do that. We've covered 3 already.
Right.
Let love fill your heart. Do it for God, not for victory. Use prayer and example to draw your friends and family to Christ. Now, assess the situation, you say here, which is chapter 4. What do you mean by assessing the situation?
Well, you have to understand what you're up against. Let's say that you're talking with somebody. I've gone through this so many times in my life, and quite frankly, all the times that I failed to do this taught me how important it is. You're having a conversation with somebody, and so is really against the Catholic Church. I used to be Catholic and I would never go back, and I've got this complaint and that complaint. And in order to really understand how to respond, how to serve that person, you have to know what's going on. Where is all this coming from? And more often than not, what I find is the best way to get to that point is to just listen a lot, ask questions, and let that other person really lay it out there. It doesn't matter what they say. They may be saying harsh things about the Catholic Church. Don't let that bother you. Just let them get it all out there. And sooner or later, I've found, you will discover what the real issue is. Now, I tell stories in this book, true stories that happened to me, various examples of how I discovered something was under the surface that we never would have reached had I just bulldozed my way in and tried to answer all their arguments. That's what I'm referring to.
You know, I was recently traveling and there was a gentleman sitting next to me. I just come back from speaking about women's issues on a new show on EWTN in Spanish, and I was impressed by the way he showed his masculine virtues. And because there were some nuns, some sisters who had just boarded the plane, they were trying to put up some heavy suitcases, carry-ons, and he jumped right over me. He was in the middle seat, but he noticed that he was on the phone and said to whoever was there, he said, I'll call you right back. Jumped right over me in a swift move without even even touching me, said, "Sisters, can I help you? Put the bags up there." When he sat down, I praised him for what he had done. And we got talking about the faith. Well, he was a fallen away Catholic who is now in a Methodist church. But when we got talking about the faith, talk about assessing the situation, he said he could never belong to a church where this and this and the other had gone on and had been covered up. And he was talking about those very,
scandals.
very sad cases, yes, of pedophilia. But he was red. He was livid. That led me to assess the situation. I thought there's something more going on here than just what he's seen, maybe something in his own personal life, I don't know. But what I did know is that in no way should I undermine what he was pointing out. That in fact, I too should share, which I do, in his, I guess outrage would be in his case, that these things go on. Would you say that had I sort of tried to cover it up and kind of calm it, that would have been a wrong way to...
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely, because number one, well, it's true for a couple of reasons. Number one is that if this issue is really an important issue for him...
He was red like a tomato.
Well, that's an undeniable fact. It doesn't mean that his reasons for it bothering him are necessarily the right reasons, but if it bothers him, it bothers him. So kind of like a good chiropractor who's going to find where the problem is and then really go to work on that. We have to have that same type of sensitivity, and assessing the situation really means that we search for those cues that tell us what's really prompting this person to have these emotions. Then we try to see if we can help in that area.
Which hopefully I was able to help him realize that, yes, we too are outraged with that there are some specific measures that are being taken place worldwide to ensure that this does not ever happen again. And also we found some common ground. I found some common ground, his love for Scripture, and I've been reading it since the age of 15, so that was an eye-opener.
I've been reading since the age of 14. So.
Oh, good for you.
Yeah. Hey, but can I give you one thing that I found to be helpful? In the case of the people who are outraged over the priest scandals and things, I found that it is, at the very least, it's thought-provoking to remind them that Jesus Christ handpicked 12 men to be his apostles. And all of them, with the possible exception of St. John, failed in the end. Judas betrayed him, Peter denied him, all the rest ran away from him. It seems that only John remained at the foot of the cross. And there were other problems that the apostles had too. And so if Judas himself, who would betray the Lord and commit suicide, if this could be true of the men that Jesus handpicked, if they could go so badly bad, then I think it would at least give us pause as we're looking at the scandals to help us see them in perspective. That the fact that you've got a bad apostle who turned bad doesn't invalidate the message of the master. And
nor the church.
Nor the church.
That they are leaders in.
Correct.
Because Christ, in fact, continued with that church full of
Peter, of those men.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, they were.
In fact, he confirmed Peter as Pope, despite the fact that he had just...
right, after Peter returned. And this is the message that I think is important now that we're touching on this, and that is that when we see these scandals, and they're not new, and we have to remember all the scandals of lay people too, it's not just priests, but this is something that is part of God's mysterious plan for his church. The field of wheat and weeds. The field is the world. And as he talks about the members of the church, he describes them as wheat and weeds. And it will always be that way. It's always been that way. And so that's part of the mystery that I think it's important when you're having this conversation that we at least inform people about that so they can have something more to think about. Yeah, okay, well that makes sense then.
I think I gave him also something to think about, and the only reason why I share this is because we all encounter situations like this. When I said in that new church that you've been frequenting for however long, I said, how do you know that this person may not end up being,
a criminal of some sort?
And he said, well, I know him personally, but I don't know Pope Benedict, he kept saying to me. And I said, God forbid this ever happened, but if you were to find that this leader or whoever succeeds him were a charlatan, what would you do? Where would you go? And he said, I don't know. And so I think I left him thinking that it could happen anywhere, and where do you go? And then I gave personal testimony saying, I, at a very young age, came to the conclusion that I am Catholic not because of any particular leader within the church, but because of its founder, Jesus Christ. In chapter 5, you talk about prepare yourself. And this goes hand in hand with what we're talking about. You can pray, you can give good example, you can love, you can assess the situation, but is that enough?
No.
Need you be equipped, as St. Paul says, for the ministry of the saints?
Sure, and of course it's a rhetorical question. Everyone knows you can't give what you don't have. I think it was Thomas Edison, I'm not sure, but I think it was him who said that enthusiasm is a great engine, but it needs knowledge for fuel. And I really subscribe to that point of view, that we could be as enthusiastic as we want, but if we don't have the content to share with people, we're not going to get very far. In fact, we could even do some damage. I'll give you a perfect example. I was speaking somewhere, I forget where, and during the lunch break, there was a young Catholic fellow who was engaged in a vigorous debate with a Protestant. And the Protestant who was there for the seminar, he, I guess, was asking about Mary, or Mary's role in the church. And so this young, enthusiastic Catholic, probably in his early 20s, he was defending the Immaculate Conception of the Blessed Virgin Mary by saying Mary had to be immaculate, because if she were not immaculately conceived, if she was not free from sin, she would have passed on a sinful human nature to Jesus. So she had to. Well, obviously, the Protestant who was sharp, he said, well, wait a minute, if that's true, then Mary's parents would both have to have been immaculately conceived, because they would have passed down a tainted nature. But then their parents and their parents and their parents. And so it obviously became a very ridiculous position that this young Catholic was trying to defend. So I kind of gently came in and I said, he's got the right idea, but let me fine-tune this a little bit. And then I showed why that doctrine is not necessary. It's true, but it's not necessary to be true. It's fitting, but not necessary. And there's a really good example that's always stuck in my mind of a young Catholic who's full of zeal, who loves God, who is trying to defend the faith, but he didn't have the knowledge quite there yet, so he was actually creating more of a problem than he was a solution. So that's what I'm trying to deal with here, is to show how you can get to that point.
So when you say we need the content, that means that we need to be thoroughly Catholic. You have a little subtitle, proclaim what the Church teaches, no less, no more.
Right.
So we shouldn't be adding things, but we should not be taking away
Correct.
from those things.
Right. In other words, the Catholic faith is not mine to customize or to modify according to my whims. I am a faithful son of the Church, or at least by God's grace, I want to be a faithful son of the Church. And as a faithful son of the Church, my duty is to give what Jesus and the apostles gave in my own way. In other words, I'm not part of the magisterium, so I in my own way am called to do this. But if I dilute this by omitting the truth, or by saying, yeah, well, that's not really necessary, or anything like that, or if I superimpose my own things over the top of it and say, in order to be a Catholic, you have to believe all these things, plus you've got to follow this Marian apparition, or you've got to have some other type of pious act, I mean, that would be wrong too. And here again, we have to check ourselves to make sure that we're not doing it to suit ourselves.
Here I'm going to touch on a very sensitive issue, which is, well, Father so-and-so told me, Sister so-and-so said, Martha Fernández-Sardina said, and then it contradicts church teaching. Why is it so important that we know what this phrase means, ubi Petrus ibi ecclesia, where Peter is, there is the church, that we need to follow what the Pope and the bishops in union with him have taught? Is it because of that possibility that we understood wrong what a particular priest or sister or leader said, or that in fact a particular priest, sister, or leader may have said it wrong?
Yeah, so we're all capable of saying it wrong. I'm guilty of that myself, where you think, people say, you meant St. Paul, didn't you? Well, yeah, what did I say? Oh, you said Jesus. So we can all misspeak. There are times when we misspeak, and it's a simple thing. Then there are times when people simply don't know the faith. They think they do, but they don't. And then there are people who I think are malicious. They do know what the Catholic Church teaches, but for whatever reason, they refuse to present it. They present something else as an alternative to it. And I see that all the time. People agitating for women in the priesthood, or people who are agitating, saying that homosexuality, nothing wrong with it, everything's fine, God blessed you with that identity and you have to accept it and love it and act it out. No, that's not true.
And it's contrary to church teaching. In other words,
yes,
it's contrary to Christ's teaching.
It's contrary to the gospel, exactly. And that's exactly what you're saying. And so our job is not to be the morality police. We're not supposed to be doctrine police or anything like that. But when we know the truth and we know what the Church teaches, we have an obligation as baptized Catholics to uphold that, to not, certainly not to deny it, because that would lead to heresy and schism. But when we're sharing it with other people, we have to give them the truth unadulterated.
The truth, the whole truth, and
nothing but the truth. That's right.
Which is a truth that is explained and expressed and shared in love. So even if we take a touchy issue like any of those moral ones that you mentioned, or someone with a homosexual tendency or so forth, we need to express fully what the Church teaches, that person is not to be discriminated against, that the person has inherent dignity, that the person is to be loved, that the person is a brother or sister, that there are many ways in which they can participate in church life, but that they too, like heterosexual singles and
They're
married
called to the
couples.
same standard.
They're called to the same standard
That's
of
right.
chastity.
That's exactly right. And this is an important part of the current discussion that's going on in the world. You know, that's a very intensely debated subject these days. And so when I refer to people who give a slanted view on, I'm referring to Catholics. You mentioned some priests even, who know better. They know what the church teaches, and they know the doctrine, and hopefully they know why the teaching is what it is. But whether it's somebody who intentionally is being deceptive or trying to say, well, that doesn't really matter what the church says, just let's look at it this way, or if it's simple ignorance. The fact is we have to inform ourselves, we have to know so that we can be an engine that's not just running on enthusiasm. It has to run on knowledge.
That is not running people into our own gospel. As St. Paul says, if anyone preaches another gospel other than the one I have handed on to you, let him be accursed. Many times there are confusions, misconceptions about what the church teaches. And when we say the church, we mean the church that Christ founded with the leadership that he established, the Pope and the bishops in union with him. Yes, we are all church, but there is, when we say the church, the magisterium, the teaching authority of the church. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Martha.
Let's continue to discuss this book, Search and Rescue, on our next show together. So be tuned for another show with Patrick Madrid. Until we meet again, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he smile upon you and be gracious to you. May he show you his countenance and grant you his peace.
Amen.